group on Wednesday will have the same content, right? Because they don't get my half-baked version. They get some professional scientist instead of me. But so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna cover, just do a quick little overview on some slides here about the carbon cycle. Like I said, so trying hard to go from wanting to share everything with you in one semester and it being too much to trying to make sure that I boil it down to core things and I return to those core things and make sure that we leave with those. So carbon cycle and some understanding of its magnitude, what's happening and why. Okay, wait a second. Am I okay? Make sure I said record. I want to make sure I'm doing this.
You are recording, yeah.
You got the notice that said it being recorded?
Yeah.
Thank you. So carbon cycle, like I said, even I've been studying carbon cycle for quite a while. And every time I try to teach about it, every time I try to learn about it, I just become so amazed at how complicated it is and how much knowledge we've accumulated about it, right? How much we've studied it and how we really understand it in ways that 5, 10, 20 years ago, we didn't quite understand. And some of that's technology that allows us to continuously monitor, but even more so, it's really important. Like we need to get our hands around it in a way to start thinking about it, not just as something that we live off of, but something that we have to live with in a much more intimate way. So let's get into that today. So it's really neat, like I said, technology wise, when you start to think about how do we know some of these things, right? So this figure that I'm showing here is the 800,000 year record of atmospheric CO2, right? How do we know that, right? We know that because we basically harnessed logic, critical thinking, analytical chemistry, and drilling rigs to find the place that we could find that long of a record back in history, right? So by using ice cores in Antarctica and in a couple other places, basically Antarctica is the place that has the most stable ice, we're able to drill these deep ice cores down into ice deposits and discern annual depositional events, right? How much snow fell that year. They show up in these tiny ice cores as little rings, like a tree ring, right? So through this very thoughtful, logical approach and drilling multiple cores around Antarctica, we've been able to go excise the little ice ring from the core and do chemistry on it, because water is at equilibrium. I mean, CO2 is at equilibrium with water in the atmosphere. So snow traps that signal and ice traps that signal in these deposits, right? So by meticulously excising out all these rings and doing chemistry on it, we could back out what the atmospheric conditions were like across time, right? Back to 800,000 years ago, which is, not trivial. That's well beyond the extent of humans as we would think of ourselves and things like that, right? So what do we have? Now we see what the record of CO2 was across long periods of time, and you can see that it goes up and down, right? It's not stable. And that's great, right? The Earth is not constantly in the same state. It's been moving around its plates, the actual physical shape, the atmosphere, the temperature, lots of things have happened across the Earth's history, right? So you can see here that there's periods where it was warm and there was more CO2 in the atmosphere, more moving. It wasn't all trapped in that ice and snow, right? And then when it gets cold, a lot of that CO2 carbon got trapped in ice and in water, right? And that was released. And you could see that across this time, we had a lot of these glacial periods. And in the first or second lecture last module, we talked about the Pleistocene and this period of glacial activity, right? Glacials advancing and receding all the way up until 18,000-ish years ago, where there was ice all the way to Chicago, all the way to Seattle, covered all of Canada, right? And so you can see back that across the last 800,000 years, the highest CO2 detected was about 275, 300,000 years ago, right? A long time back. And here we are today, right? Way above that. We're at like 415 right now, right? We've achieved a level of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations that's hasn't been seen in tens of millions of years, like way back farther in history when there was higher CO2 or comparable CO2, but a totally different Earth than we're thinking about now. different other gases in the atmosphere, different temperatures, different plants, different biota, a lot of stuff going on, right? The reason I bring this up is because this is what we're dealing with, right? We've created these conditions as a species, right? We've done this to ourselves through our management and our burning of fossil fuels and things like that. And we know this to be pretty certain. So when you hear people talking about, well, there's some people that don't think that's true. There's a lot of people that get paid to be the contrarians, to have a contrarian in the room, right? Pretty strong consensus of science that says this is what's happening and that we are the source of this thing, okay? So that gets us more to today, right? And thinking about biogeochemistry and the carbon cycle right now, right? That's talking back in long periods of time and using very complicated things to get to that point. But really I want to talk today about the carbon cycle, right? And biogeochemistry. So the Earth has a fixed amount of carbon, right? A little bit of carbon comes in on meteors and certain types of things coming in from the outside of our atmosphere. But inside the atmosphere, we have a fixed amount of carbon, right? We have a fixed amount of elements. It's enclosed. And what biogeochemistry is understanding the rates at which things move around. Does it move around quickly or slowly, right? And so we'll talk about two carbon cycles or two big ideas, a slow one and a fast one, right? The slow one is one that's at geologic time periods, things that happen 5, 10, 100,000 year, million year, like that kind of time scale. The burial of sediments in the ocean would be something that's happening at a long-term time scale. And then the fast or more recent carbon cycle is like biologic timescales, right? Things that are happening now, things that are happening in our lifetimes, 500, 1,000 years, that kind of stuff. How fast can things turn over? How fast can things move, right? And that's what we'll be talking about with respect to this class is, how much carbon can we store in soil? That's all fast carbon cycle stuff, right? We've already proven that if we till until we can emit carbon, and we can also store carbon with proper practices. So don't squint at this too long. You'll see it again. This is like a preview of the one I'm going to record tonight. It's a longer format version of this, but just kind of the detailed out carbon cycle, and all the links that I provided on the script will take you to this stuff. And I'll show you that at the end. You can go bathe in this as long as you want. There's all this stuff out there. But this just gives you the idea of there's a lot of things going on all the time. From right now, from me exhaling, right? I'm affecting the carbon cycle. I had a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch, and right now I'm respiring off carbon as I metabolize that stuff, right? So it's happening right now. And like I said, everything else in between. So this is just to get you the idea that a couple big picture things to think about. Soils are the largest terrestrial pool. That came up last week. Over here, the ocean matters a lot. I'm going to touch on it a little bit in the full format video lecture, but I'm not oceanographer, and there's enough to cover just talking about soils and ag. But yes, there's a lot of carbon in the ocean, and the ocean has been this massive buffer, right, that allows us to have sea surface temperatures. It's been absorbing a lot of carbon. Some of that's going through sediment cycles down into the ocean. Some of it's dissolved. The pH of the ocean's changing because of the equilibrium with CO2 and water. And like I said, I'll get to that in the lecture more so I can suss it out a little bit more. But largest pool, carbon, soil, it's about the same as the atmosphere and all vegetation combined, right? So we see here, estimates are 15 to 24 petagrams. And you can see a petagram is 10 to the 15th grams, right? Or 10 to the 12th kilograms. It's a lot, large numbers. It's a petagram is a billion tons, 10 to the 9th tons. And that this number, that's between 15 and 24. That's a large range because we don't really know. Haven't gone out and actively tried to survey it to get the numbers. It depends on how deep you're quantifying. If you say a meter, it's one thing. You could go down to 3. There's a lot of places where there's carbon down to 3 or 4 meters. It might only be in 0.25% of mass, but you start adding up meters of that. That's a lot of carbon. All vegetation, 4.5 to 6.5 hundred, and the atmosphere is about in that 590 range, right? That's all the carbon in the fast carbon cycle is in those components, either what's in vegetation, what's in the atmosphere that's being drawn into the vegetation through photosynthesis, and or being stored in carbon and soil, pardon me. Then this other one over here, permafrost, right? We'll get to that in a little bit in some detail, but just the reality that there's a lot of carbon stored in cold places, in frozen soils. And what's happening in those cold places? They're warming up. And when they stop being frozen year round, we're going to have release of carbon to the atmosphere. So a big concern, there's been a lot of work in polar regions looking at soils and thawing, because the concern is if the polar regions, the cold regions start to thaw, especially in the northern hemisphere, the upper latitudes of Alaska and across the Yukon and in Siberia and across northern Asia and Europe, that you start warming those places where they're not frozen all the time, that permafrost pool is no longer protected. There's a bunch of carbon stored in those soils because it's in a freezer, right? But if you thaw that freezer out, there could be a lot more carbon pulsing into the atmosphere. And we're already at a very high level, right? And the levels could go even higher. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So here's a nice, here's a drilled down version of the North American carbon cycle, right? So we were just talking about the globe in total. Now we could talk about just North America. So the US and Canada, right? And now we're talking about teragrams instead of petagrams, right? So 1,000 teragrams is a petagram. So we were talking in this last slide about annual flux to the atmosphere. I didn't get there, but we're talking about 1 petagram flux, 2 petagrams, total pools here, atmospheric increase of 4 petagrams per year. The entire the atmospheric pool associated with North America is a quarter of that. So we're emitting a quarter of the CO2 that the world emits on an annual basis, with only like 5% of the global population or something like that, right? If we're at 7 billion, 8 billion, and we're Canada and US combined, we're only at less than 400 million, right? So like we're putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere because we have carbon intensive lifestyles. We have the highest standard of living. We eat the most meat and dairy products. We drive big cars and like those kinds of things that matter, right? Versus other countries and other folks that don't have the same level of economic prosperity, I guess is what we'll call it at this point. So here's our version, right? And when you start drilling down, you start thinking about the main ones, right? Ecosystem uptake by photosynthesis and re-emission by burning wood, by wetlands, by fossil fuel emissions, right? We burn cars, we burn fuel in cars, we burn coal, we burn wood, right? All those things are going into the atmosphere, and only so much is being drawn back down through photosynthesis, which is the primary driver of carbon being sequestered into terrestrial systems, right? All that CO2 that's being drawn in through photosynthesis. So how do we know about this stuff, right? We talked about one of the first people to bring this to anyone's attention was a woman scientist in the 1850s named Eunice Foote, and I'll bring some Eunice Foote up later and let you know about her. And she predicted this was going to happen, right? 1840s and 50s is when we just started burning coal in the industrial push. And people were like, wait a second, if you start burning all this stuff that was buried underground, where's it going to go? Right? It's going to go in the atmosphere. So people knew that this was going to be a problem at some point, right? So fast forward into the post-war period, and here we were talking about the atmospheric records from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii on the Big Island, right? So after World War II, in that period, and we had a great expansion of science and technology across the world, right? And in the US, for sure, there was research at universities. All of these companies had these research labs, and all these amazing things were happening. And people were trying to predict and think about what was going on and what was going to happen from some of these things. So here we had this, oh God, I'm forgetting his name right now, but the dude that said we should measure atmospheric CO2. That's probably going to be something that we should care about, right? So where would be the best place to do that? The place that's got nice mixed conditions. It's not going to be influenced by a smokestack or by an urban center or something like that. Hey, how about the Big Island of Hawaii? That's a great one, man. If you're a scientist and you want to make a career where you get to kick it on the Big Island of Hawaii and do your science, that's like thinking at the next level. It's that 7-dimensional chess they talk about. It's like, let's find the best place to do it. Oh, and by the way, it's on the Big Island of Hawaii. I guess we'll have to go there and do some science, right? So they went out to the Big Island. You know, there's 2 14,000-foot volcanoes on the Big Island, yet another reason why Hawaii is amazing. And so they went and started taking atmospheric samples from the top of a tall volcano in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? Because they figured that's the best place that represents the globe untainted by an individual source, okay? So over here in the mid-50s, they started taking physical samples out of the atmosphere and analyzing them, right? And at the beginning, they were doing it like once a week. It was laborious titration-based old school chemistry that they were doing. And then through science and technology, now we're able to have, continuous monitoring. And they've learned a lot from this, right? So here's the atmospheric record on the right-hand side from the mid-50s until now, right? And you can see that it's getting higher, right? From from 1956 era, it was about 310 parts per million. And now, like I said, we're about 415, 420 per year, and it's only going up. So in 60, 70 years, we've increased the atmospheric CO2 by 100 parts per million, right? It's not trivial, it's a lot. And if you go back to pre-industrial, the 1850s version, it was about 280 parts per million. So across the industrial period, we've gone from 280 to almost 420. So 140 ppm increase just across the time frame that we've been burning fossil fuels, starting with coal and then moving into liquids, petroleum in the teens and 20s. And then it really picked up after World War II, right? Because we started tapping into the Middle East. We started going into South America. The Russians started tapping their oil reserves too. So Indonesia, Colombia, places that didn't have any fossil fuels being tapped. And we went in and started pushing that stuff all over the world, right? That's why we've been at war in all those places for a long time. So on the left, it's a shorter term, right? It's a narrowed down version. Why? So first question is, why does this go up and down, right? Why is this line, right? This is the black line's the average, and the red line is kind of the monthly average that's moving. Why does it go up and down?
I would guess something with weather patterns, probably. I was actually going to ask you about that. I'm not sure specifically.
Maybe.
I always heard it was from the trees.
Yes.
So they absorb carbon, the leaves fall, they release carbon.
Yes. So first thing, if you look at a map, right, most of the land on the planet is north of the equator, right? The northern hemisphere has the most, or the northern half of the world has the majority of the land, right? The southern half, part of South America, but it's the skinny part, right? Part of Africa, but it's not the biggest part. Australia, and then some of the islands in Philippines, and in that part, Indonesia, that part of the world. But the majority of the land on the planet is in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so right here, it's probably January, right? Our winter, or maybe a little later. It's like right now, right? And this is probably August. So yes, as it's spring and summer in the northern hemisphere, and all those trees and all those plants and all those grasses are taking in CO2, reducing it into simple sugars with water, nutrients, and sun's energy, they're drawing the atmospheric CO2 level down. They're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and fixing it in biomass, right? And then across the fall, winter, and into the spring, it's being re-emitted by decomposition, by root respiration, by all the processes that keep the carbon cycle flowing, which is what we're going to talk about when we get into soil organic matter and other things. And then it starts over, right? Spring comes, CO2 starts to drop, because in the southern hemisphere, there's just not that corresponding land mass to have that huge drawdown that we have in the northern hemisphere. I learned this probably like 6 or 7 years ago. And I was just like, holy shit. How's that? It's like, it's pretty mind bending, right? When you think about it. The largest flux of carbon in and out of the atmosphere annually is plants and soil re-emitting, right? Soil respiration and photosynthesis every year, right? It draws down as plants taking carbon into wood, into things, into leaves. They get decomposed back off, and you get the rise in it again. And you see it here, going up across time, which is really cool, right? Hopefully that will stick in your head. You're like, that's neat. That's something you should share with anyone. If you can explain that to anyone, you're doing good, right? Variable landmass. One hemisphere has way more photosynthetic capacity than the other, and it re-emits. Super neat idea, right? So that's what's happening annually. And then obviously it's climbing because we're emitting carbon, right? We're emitting carbon. I didn't drive today. Right? I rode my e-back bike last night, right? But like every industrial thing we do, heating our homes, using your barbecue, all that kind of stuff has some cost, right? It has a carbon cost, especially if it's carbon that came from some fossil source that was buried long ago. It was photosynthetic capture at some point, but not in our slow carbon cycle. It's from the old, not from our fast carbon cycle. It's from the old slow carbon cycle, and we're adding it to the atmosphere, okay? So this is how it all happened, right? We started off by changing land use, cutting down trees, tilling grasslands, and putting in agriculture. And that was the original bump, right? And then we started burning coal. Then we started burning oil in the 20s, right? Like Pennsylvania, there was a ton of oil in Southern California too, right? It was all about it. And then we started getting into more purified gases like natural gas, because we started to get better capacity to capture that stuff. And then these others are like concrete. Concrete production is a huge source of CO2 emissions. You take CaCO3 and heat it into CaO, and you emit CO2, right? So as you make concrete, you're emitting carbon dioxide. So it's not a non-trivial source of carbon, okay? We're gonna dive into this more, because I don't wanna, it's enough to wrap your head around. So I found this one on Twitter last night. This is the craziest thing I've seen in a while. So here's an article from 2019. It was just published this last year in one of the nature journals. And it's basically saying that at this point, humanity has produced more stuff than all of the biomass on the planet, right? So here you can see, here's their graph showing the things that they're counting, right? Plastics, metals, asphalt, bricks, aggregate, concrete. And you can see that over time, by the year 2020, we have now reached a point where we've produced as much or more stuff than there was in all biomass on the planet before, right? And you can look at it here. It really breaks it down for you. You can see from the turn of the century, early on, it was this, it says wood, glass, and plastic. This was all wood, right? We were using wood for fuel. We were using wood to build things. Right here, the red was metals. It's stayed pretty consistent, right? The brown is bricks. So we used to use a lot of bricks, and now not so much, right? Because we found alternatives. Aggregate, right? Aggregate stayed pretty the same. We use a lot of aggregate, right? We use aggregate for building dams, for building road beds, for putting in concrete, right? And then you can see the rise in concrete with the real steep rise post 1950, right? After World War II, interstate road systems, concrete dams, high rises, all kinds of elevated roads. And then in the last 20 years, this kick for sure has been the expansion of megacities in China and a lot of intensive capital improvement in other countries, right? So now you can see the impact, what humans are doing to the planet. It's not just carbon, it's all these things, right? And in a couple lectures back, I'd already forgotten too, but that's why you write notes. They're talking about the Anthropocene. Like, it's clear that we've altered terrestrial cycles humans have of all these different things. Okay. Any questions or just like a deep sigh of disbelief?
Actually, I was just gonna say about plastic. I feel like hemp plastic could be a big future. I don't know if you've heard of that at all.